All right, welcome back, students of world history. Today we're going to be talking about World War I and primarily the outbreak of war and how the world is moving from handling their differences and settling their differences between countries specifically through military means on a smaller scale. We're going to be actually talking about how the world starts to transition into a more global way of trying to understand how these countries can either get along, not get along, and ultimately wage war against one another. So we're going to be talking about the move towards global war, and specifically in this video lecture, we're going to be talking about the main causes of war and how war actually broke out. I will remind you of our essential question, that is, to what extent should war be viewed as a last resort when dealing with other countries? And before we get to the nitty-gritty about World War I want you guys to just take 1 to 2 minutes, pause the video, and take a second to answer the question up at the top here. What do we already know about World War I? Try to jot down some ideas about what you think you already know about it. It could be from a video game, it could be from a movie, it could be from the History Channel. Just kind of jot down your own understanding of what you think World War I is all about, things that might happen. It could be very, very basic, could be super, super complex. But take a minute or two to try to get yourself in the mood of understanding what you already know about World War I. So, in terms of understanding what you might already know about World War I, its time frame lasted between 1914 and 1918. It's known as the Great War prior to 1939, and this is primarily because of its scale and what it actually meant to those involved, being the soldiers, the countries, and the communities. Prior to World War I, Europe had generally been at peace for roughly 30 years. There was some growing conflict in Europe and Africa and Asia and even the Pacific Ocean islands, primarily over imperialism. But this is kind of adding fuel to the fire, but not necessarily yet the main cause. But approximately, with World War I, approximately 35 to 40 million people died, were wounded, or wound up missing. And it created a path for World War II to occur. Some things that students also have an understanding of is that Hitler was a soldier for Germany during this time period, but this is not characteristically the war that is most closely associated with Adolf Hitler's rise to power and the fascist regime of the Nazi Party in Germany. That will come later when we talk about World War II, but for now, some students have an understanding that he did take part in as a soldier in Germany during World War I. So let's start by trying to understand the historical context behind the Great War. These countries prior to the outbreak of war had been working for peace. It had generally been at peace for roughly 30 years in Europe, and over hundreds of peace organizations and conferences had been meeting regularly to make sure that all these countries got along throughout the European continent. Many people actually believe that war was a thing of the past, but with these tensions over imperialism starting to rise, some started to kind of fade that understanding of peace. So I'm going to be talking about 4 main causes of war, and we will add an additional one at the end of this that kind of creates a spark between all of these causes to ultimately lead to war. So the first of these 4 in this acronym called M.A.I.N is militarism. The second is alliances. The third is imperialism. And the last is nationalism that make up the main causes for war. To start with the M, militarism is defined as the policy of glorifying military power and keeping an army prepared for war. We see throughout World War I new military technologies being developed here. There starts to become an arms race between the countries to kind of demonstrate this power that they have in terms of their military. And we also see, in terms of militarism, a glorification of war and this kind of push to get people to support the war or to aid the war effort both at home and abroad as a soldier on the front lines. What we're going to see here in this table is a table of mobilization. And mobilization is the policy of keeping a military prepared for war with the adequate supplies, personnel, and resources that they need. So you can kind of see that in this chart, we have roughly 6 countries up at the top, and then we have how many people they have in their standing army, their reserves, and their total. So if you're looking at in total which countries had the most soldiers prepared to go to war, you had both Germany with 11 million people and Russia with 12 million people, and shortly followed by Great Britain, France, and Austria-Hungary. So take a second to kind of analyze this chart and understand where these countries were at in terms of how prepared they were just from the military personnel standpoint. And once you're done, go ahead and resume the video. So, having an understanding of this chart, do you think that that each country's decision to mobilize these armies was a good or a bad thing? And thinking about this, maybe jot down a couple ideas in response to this question on your note sheet of paper, and go ahead and resume the video whenever you're done with that. So, to maybe debrief some of the things that you might have been talking about in that 1 or 2 bullet pointed list that you just had in response to this question, countries might have been itching to show the power of the militaries that they had built up. So this might have been a reason why these countries mobilizing and their active mobilization was a good thing, is that they were able to use the preparation, the work that they had put in to actually have some sort of sustenance, but it also this was also increased by the rise of nationalistic feelings and this urge for people to say, yes, we have this army ready to go, we have the supplies, we have a reason to go to war, we should do it. So whether or not you think it's a good thing or a bad thing may kind of change over the duration of the next couple weeks as we start talking about World War I a little bit more. But in terms of understanding the strategy to go to war for these countries in historical context, we will see how the landscape starts to change. The A in the M.A.I.N acronym stands for alliances, and alliances were generally designed to keep peace, but it also creates a dangerous system. So to begin this discussion of alliances, we got to talk about this guy named Otto von Bismarck. He was the German chancellor during this time period and prime minister, and he started to make pacts and alliances with other countries as early as 1879 when Germany allied with Austria-Hungary, again in 1881 when they allied with Russia, and then in 1882 when Germany, Austria-Hungary ally with Italy, that create what is called the Triple Alliance, which will be pretty important for us as we move forward throughout this unit. So to kind of give you a visualization of those alliances, you see that alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then 1881, Germany's alliance with Russia, and then Germany's alliance with Italy along with Austria-Hungary. It should be noted that just because Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy are all allied with each other, that Austria-Hungary and Italy are not also allied with Russia. This was a mutually exclusive alliance. So keep that in mind as we go through the next few slides. This kind of created an isolation for France from Russia, from the Greek peninsula, as well as from the Ottoman Empire. So this starts to create kind of this, power concentration in the center of Europe. And we start to see that these shifting alliances are threatening peace, and this is only more troubled with the internal dysfunction in Germany. So leading up to World War I, we see that Kaiser Wilhelm II took power at the age of 29, and within 2 years, he broke away from Otto von Bismarck's ideas and agendas and his policies that had dominated German politics since the 1860s. And the Kaiser embarked on his so-called new course, which was a period of personal rule in which he appointed chancellors who were kind of like the upper echelon of society, upper echelon civil servants, sorry, rather than statesmen. So he kind of kind of appealed to more of the general population rather than the upper echelon of society. And Bismarck bitterly predicted that Wilhelm would ultimately lead Germany to ruin. And as a side note, we should know that in 1892, Russia forms a defensive military alliance with France with this kind of internal dysfunction with Germany. And in 1890, Germany's treaty with Russia actually lapses. So that alliance no longer exists. And you can kind of see that in this visual where that alliance between Germany and Russia no longer exists. And we also see that in 1892, Russia forms a defensive military alliance with France, which is going to be pretty important as we start to see these alliances start to form elsewhere around Europe. So, giving yourself maybe a minute or two to debrief, in what ways do you think Kaiser Wilhelm put Germany into a strategically bad situation? And how might these alliances systems be setting Europe up for a potential disaster? Maybe think about both of those questions. Pause the video and resume it when you are ready to continue. So, Bismarck had feared that if France and Russia ever allied with each other, Germany could face a war on two fronts, basically two places of war, which would divide its army in half. So, if we're kind of going back to this map here, that's exactly what happened. That military alliance between Germany and Russia lapsed, and now we have Germany kind of smack dab in between France and Russia in terms of if a war were to break out. Germany would be facing a war on two fronts, just as Otto von Bismarck had predicted. So now we see in 1907, Britain forms an alliance with both France and Russia that creates the Triple Entente. Now we have our two major alliances really taking place for World War I. That is the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. And this kind of creates this modern kind of alliance network going into World War I that we see here, where Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary are allied with one another, and Russia, Great Britain, France, and eventually the United States are allied with each other as well. So, with Europe divided into two clear alliances, we're kind of set up for a potential failure. But what possible problems could you anticipate happening in the future? So take maybe a minute or two to jot down some ideas for that on your piece of note paper and begin when you are done with that. So one of the main concerns is that any dispute with this alliances system could basically pull all the other countries into a continental war. And this is where this war is different than others. Is that prior to this, many wars were kind of localized to specific countries or specific regions. But with this alliance system, we're starting to see that many countries throughout a larger region are all kind of based off of their alliances that they've made, are kind of being forced to go to war if a problem were to occur. And that is where we begin talking about imperialism and later with nationalism. So with imperialism, tensions were starting to become higher, especially with the alliance systems kind of increasing this kind of tension between countries. But we start to see that colonists are acted as resource providers and combatants in these regions that they controlled, such as England and France over regions throughout Africa and Asia. And many of these colonies hoped to achieve independence after the war and were promised this as long as they supported them and in terms of the colonies supporting them and the people there willing to fight for them, but few actually received this independence. This only created more problems for us as we start talking about World War II. But this still competition between European countries to take over as much land as possible throughout the world started to create some more rising tensions that put more stress on these alliance systems. And the rise of nationalism, rounding out that main acronym, which is pride in your country, slowly from the Middle Ages started to develop within many of these European countries where people were starting to feel an increased sense of pride in their country, and this nationalism grew to this point where people were getting we're really feeling a sense of pride when their European countries were going out and imperializing other countries, and now with the outbreak of war, we're going to see that these people are starting to support their countries in terms of their success on the battlefield, and how that creates this nationalistic feeling and pride. Winning a war or doing well in a war is going to create good feelings at home rather than bad feelings. So we see this rise of nationalism where people start to feel emotionally attached, increased emotional attachment to their country, especially during World War One. So I want you to think about maybe what's an example where you can think that there's other feelings for your country where you feel an emotional attachment to something you belong to. And I always like to relate this to maybe sports teams or your high school. You know, when your high school plays one of your rivals, you're going to feel a little bit more emotion going on that week, maybe for a football game or a basketball game, especially when you're at the game itself, than you might some other school that doesn't have such an intense rivalry. The same thing with your sports teams. So this nationalism that's rising in terms of people's emotions throughout these countries is starting to create conflicts, especially within countries and between countries. And this largely occurs in this region called the Balkans, which is this area right here that is surrounding Greece and Bulgaria and Romania that is going to be referred to as the powder keg of Europe. And Otto von Bismarck comes back again with another quote saying that one day the great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. So let's see what that actually is going to turn into for us. So since 1566, we start to see the slow decrease in the size of the Ottoman Empire and this kind of fading region and empire, and we start to see more nationalistic feelings and ethnic I guess you could pride in their in people's ethnicities start to rise up in these regions, and they start to form their own countries throughout the Ottoman Empire. So we start to see that over time the Ottoman Empire is weakened, and at the same time nationalism is developed in some of its lands, in which we see Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Montenegro, Serbia all start to become their own independent countries and unite under one banner. So in terms of these fading empires and growing ethnic groups, we start with Serbia, and Serbia was predominantly Slavic. They wanted to recreate an empire of the Slavs, and Russia, being Slavic as well, supported Serbia in these aspirations. But Austria-Hungary did not want Serbia to incite the Slavic population. And you see, because if the Slavs create an alliance with Russia, Austria-Hungary is going to be kind of left right in the middle of these two regions, and with Russia being allied with France and Italy, this is only going to cause some additional problems for that alliance system as well. So Austria-Hungary was really trying to do everything they could to kind of decrease this conflict with Serbia. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina is where in 1908 we start to see this conflict increase. Both were largely Slavic in their ethnicity, and Austria-Hungary had basically occupied or taken over both Bosnia and Herzegovina, which created a lot of outraged feelings within Serbia, who felt that most of these people were Slavic. They should all kind of be united here. So this increased tensions and ultimately resulted in a nationalistic or terroristic group called the Black Hand to ultimately decide to take action against the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, that is Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, who was visiting Sarajevo with his wife Sophie on June 28th of 1914. The couple was riding in an open car throughout the streets of Sarajevo to see the people. And what we're going to see is this assassination, this act of assassination, is going to be the event that sparks all of these other causes of war to ultimately result in war itself. So in July 23rd of the same year, Austria-Hungary gives Serbia an ultimatum, a list of demands that they knew Serbia could not agree to. Serbia knew that if they didn't agree to it, it would mean war with a more powerful army. And Serbia agreed to most of these demands, but offered to settle others by international conference. And on July 28th, Austria-Hungary rejected Serbia's offer and declared war on Serbia. That triggered Serbia's alliance with Russia. Russia starts mobilizing its army for war, and European diplomats start to scramble and persuade Russia and Austria-Hungary to negotiate, but at that point it was too late. Looking forward to how this act by one terrorist organization ultimately leads to the outbreak of war, we're going to see that now the world is in a global conflict. How do these countries respond? This is going to be a new thing for many of these countries in terms of understanding how they're going to wage war and how they're going to interact both politically and military-wise with other countries. So we're going to see how the world responds to this act of assassination moving forward.